Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to be hosting this webinar to talk about our publication, The State of the World Birds, and how we have used this time as an opportunity to talk about the Aichi Targets, the agenda that was set up by the governments 10 years ago in Nagoya, and how they have been met or not. You're going to hear from our chief scientist, Stu Butchert, and Lucy Haskell from our State of the World Birds team, as well as from our head of the policy program, Noel Campbell. I just want to, before giving the floor to this stellar panel, I want to give a huge thanks to the Aage V Jensen Foundation that has been an extraordinary supporter of our State of the World Birds. They have truly believed in how we can use birds and their data as an extraordinary ambassador for the rest of nature, and how this data has been helping us set up not only our conservation action and our conservation agenda, but also in this case, help us push for these targets to become a key part of the global biodiversity framework that will be discussed and negotiated at the Convention of Biological Diversity next year in Kunming. I want to thank you all for joining us. There was a question about translation. Unfortunately, today we're having the webinar only in English, but I hope that in the future we could actually try to get translation happening. So without further ado, with immense thanks to the Jensen Foundation for their support, I would like to give the floor to Stu Butchert, our chief scientist. Stu.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a very great pleasure to have the chance to join with a couple of my colleagues this evening to present to you some of the content from this report on birds and biodiversity targets that we launched just a few weeks ago. We're going to be summarizing what that report tells us. And again, to reiterate Patricia's gratitude to the Jensen Foundation, who have provided many years of support for this area of our work. So to start with, I'll just sort of touch on some of the wider context in which we're considering these issues. And I'm sure none of you need reminding that we live in pretty dangerous times from the perspective of the environment. We've got an extinction crisis happening. The IPBES Global Assessment UN report released last year showed that there may be up to 1 million species threatened with extinction. Species are moving towards extinction faster than ever before in human history. And at the same time, we've got a climate crisis as well, of course. And both of those are, and the destruction of nature that drives both of those also underpin the emergence of zoonotic diseases like the current COVID-19 pandemic. So there are real risks to nature and to human society at present. But we also live in a time of opportunity. Governments are investing vast sums to help economies recover from the impacts of COVID, and that those resources could be channeled in an environmentally friendly way to support healthy ecosystems, to provide the benefits to people that derive from nature. It's clear that nature underpins the delivery of most of the sustainable development goals that the world's governments have signed up to. And there's more awareness of these issues than ever before. So there's a real time of opportunity to scale up our efforts to tackle these crises. Next slide. And so, as Patricia mentioned, a decade ago, recognizing the crisis that we faced and the impacts of the destruction of nature, the world's governments adopted really quite a bold strategic plan for biodiversity for the following decade. That included a set of 20 targets, so-called Aichi Biodiversity Targets, named after the prefecture in Japan, where the agreement was signed. And those targets were to tackle the loss and degradation of nature by improving the state of nature, reducing the threats to it and addressing the underlying drivers of those pressures, enhancing the benefits to people from nature, and strengthening the implementation of the Convention on Biological Diversity to achieve these aims. So now at the end of that period, it's 2020, and it's timely therefore to ask the question whether we achieve the targets and what can we learn from successes and failures and progress or lack of it to each of the targets, and how can that inform a post-2020 plan for nature that's currently being negotiated. Well, birds are uniquely powerful in helping to answer those questions, and that's why we've focused on them in the report that we have published. Why are birds so good? Well, they're very effective indicators of wider biodiversity. They're the best known class of organisms. They're found worldwide in all countries, all ecosystems, nearly all habitats. They're generally fairly straightforward to detect and to identify and critically to count, so we can monitor their populations. And those populations are responsive to environmental change. So they're great indicators of the wider health of ecosystems. And importantly, we know that the solutions to safeguard and restore their populations and habitats are typically relevant to wildlife more broadly. So the conservation that we do targeted at birds benefits other groups of organisms. And so we used data from birds to assess progress towards each target, drawing on our own extensive data sets of which species are closest to extinction, the threats that impact them, the most important sites for their conservation worldwide, and research that we've carried out both in-house and with in collaboration with academic and research groups around the world, as well as the indicators, the biodiversity indices that we have developed using those data sets and drawing on the wider scientific literature. And we scored each target on this 5-point scale, and overall found that there's been an overall failure to meet these targets. For none of the 20 targets have they been met in full. But encouragingly and positively, for each of the targets, we can find examples that give reasons for hope. So positive trends, success stories, either for subsets of species or for particular locations or regions, or for particular components or aspects of the target, if not for the entire target. And these can show us the way forward for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. They can provide indications of what we need to see in that global plan, in the commitments that governments adopt, to ensure that we don't see another decade of failure for nature. And so if you move on to the next slide, we're now going to hear from Lucy, who's going to go through some examples for a subset of the targets, showing what we found, what birds tell us about our progress, and reasons for optimism. Over to you, Lucy. Thanks.
Lucy, before you jump in, just let me tell everybody, first of all, it's absolutely wonderful to see from all corners of the world, from Australia to Colorado and the United States, people signing in. Thank you so much for joining us. If you have questions, just paste them on the Q&A section of the webinar. We'll be following with Sarah, and then after Noelle's presentation, we'll come into the questions. So sorry, Lucy, for the interruption, but I forgot to say that at the beginning. Over to you.
No worries. Thanks, Patricia. So I'm going to take you through some of the Aichi targets, looking at what birds can tell us about progress towards each target. And the targets were grouped into 5 overarching strategic goals. So strategic goal A was to address the underlying causes of biodiversity loss by mainstreaming biodiversity across government and society. Target 1 focused on raising awareness of the value of biodiversity. overall, we know that there are still far too few people aware of the scale of the loss of nature and of the impacts of that loss of nature. But birds are spectacularly popular and are increasingly engaging people and helping to raise awareness. So, for example, several BirdLife partners, such as Natagora in Belgium, have seen a growth in membership over the last 10 years, suggesting that the number of people taking an interest in the natural world is growing. Similarly, participation in Euro Birdwatch has increased by over 50%. This is a Europe-wide initiative to encourage people to record bird observations over a single weekend, and is just one of a number of examples of how birds are engaging people across society and bringing nature into their lives. Target 2 focused on mainstreaming biodiversity values. Nature continues to be lost because its values aren't properly integrated into decision-making across all sectors. But data on birds and their key sites are increasingly being used by the private sector to screen for biodiversity when planning projects and developments. For example, IBAT, which is the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, is a platform that was developed by a partnership between BirdLife, IUCN, and others to make biodiversity data more accessible to the private sector, enabling them to make their businesses more environmentally friendly. And IBAT is now widely used by the private sector for that purpose. Similarly, BirdLife's Soaring Bird Sensitivity Mapping tool is used throughout the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Northeast Africa to support sustainable wind energy expansion. And these are both brilliant examples of how data on birds are supporting the private sector to operate in a more environmentally friendly way. Target 3 was to reform incentives, eliminating those that are harmful to nature and introducing new ones with more positive impacts. Perverse incentives such as subsidies for fossil fuels or overfishing still underpin much of biodiversity loss. For example, the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe increased crop yields but drove really rapid declines in farmland birds and other biodiversity. But birds show that pro-nature reforms do have beneficial effects. For example, the American government introduced several key conservation programs linked to subsidies under the Farm Bill, which require farmers to implement nature-friendly initiatives. And following the introduction of those subsidies, wetland bird populations have grown dramatically, and forest and grassland bird populations have stabilized after decades of declines. So this just goes to show that providing incentives to restore and conserve nature can really help species to recover. Target 4 aimed to achieve sustainable production and consumption, so keeping the use of natural resources within safe ecological limits. Unsustainable use of species is one of the top 3 threats to nature and is driving declines in the status of the world's birds, as shown by this graph, which is a version of the Red List Index illustrating trends driven by use. For those of you not familiar with the Red List Index, it shows the overall trend in extinction risk for a set of species, balancing those deteriorating in status against those improving due to successful conservation action. So what this graph is telling us is that more species are deteriorating due to threats such as overhunting than are improving owing to successful control of those threats. But again, there are inspiring examples of success. For example, in Nagaland in India, a highly successful community conservation program has put a complete stop to the overhunting of hundreds of thousands of Amma falcons, which pass through the area on migration every year. And this is just one of many examples from across the world where there have been successful efforts to control unsustainable hunting. Strategic goal B was to reduce the direct pressures on biodiversity and promote sustainable use. So target 5 was to reduce habitat loss and degradation. The world has completely failed to make any substantial progress towards this target, as illustrated by the graph on the left showing the loss of forest in important bird and biodiversity areas, IBAs. So since 2010, 3.4% of forest cover has been lost from key biodiversity areas identified for forest-dependent birds. But there have been local successes where political will can be mobilised. For example, the Yellow Sea coast is one of the world's most important sites for migratory water birds, such as the critically endangered spoon-billed sandpiper. Large areas of this really vital habitat have been lost since the 1980s due to wetland reclamation. But in recent years, both China and South Korea declared 20 World Heritage Sites around the coast of the Yellow Sea, helping to secure the future of those sites and the multitude of species that rely on them. Target 6 focused on ensuring sustainable fishing practices. Many of the world's fisheries remain unsustainable, both for the fish targeted and for other species caught as bycatch, which include a lot of globally threatened seabirds, or those that are impacted through depletion of their food source. But efforts by BirdLife and others have had some spectacular success in tackling this issue. As you can see from this map, from Chile right across to South Africa, mitigation measures and regulations have drastically reduced seabird bycatch. For example, there's been a 99% reduction in albatrosses killed in the South African hake trawl fishery since 2005, with similar success in places like Chile and Namibia. Target 7 was to ensure sustainable agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry. Unsustainable agriculture is the primary threat to the world's birds and is still driving declines, as shown by the graph on the left showing the European Farmland Bird Index, which shows the average population abundance of species characteristic of farmland habitats. But agri-environment schemes, such as establishing wildflower margins around agricultural fields and leaving overwinter stubbles, are benefiting common farmland birds. The graph on the right shows the population growth rate of common farmland birds in relation to the percentage of farmland under agri-environment schemes. And as you can see, in areas with a higher proportion of farmland under such schemes, the population growth rate is less negative, meaning that declines are less severe. Target 9 aimed to tackle the issue of invasive alien species. Invasive species are a major threat to many birds, particularly birds on oceanic islands, which have evolved in the absence of mammalian predators, and they continue to drive species towards extinction. But we have been increasingly successful at eradicating invasive species on islands to enable native ecosystems to recover. So to date, we have eradicated nearly 300 mammal populations on over 170 islands, benefiting over 160 native bird species, which is a fantastic result. Target 10 focused on minimizing pressures on ecosystems that are particularly impacted by climate change. Climate change is having major impacts on species, and those impacts continue to grow. The Climatic Impact Index shows a strong signal of climate change on bird population trends in both continents for which we have good data, Europe and North America. Warm-adapted species tend to benefit, and cold-adapted species tend to decline, but importantly, there are many more losers than there are winners. However, the global network of important bird and biodiversity areas, if effectively conserved, is predicted to remain resilient under climate change. Species distributions will shift and sites will lose some priority species and gain others, but nearly all species will retain suitable climate somewhere within the IBA network. Strategic Goal C was to improve the status of biodiversity by safeguarding ecosystems, species, and genetic diversity. So Target 11 focused on area-based conservation. Protected areas are a cornerstone of conservation efforts, and there has been significant growth in protected areas globally since 2010, particularly in marine protected areas. But they've not all been well targeted at the most important locations, such as important bird and biodiversity areas, and many are inadequately managed. Almost half of IBAs are in an unfavourable condition, and over half are under high pressure and have little conservation action targeted towards them. However, encouraging research by BirdLife suggests that many unprotected sites are still managed for conservation, for example, as community reserves. And these so-called other effective area-based conservation measures may play an important role in protecting biodiversity in the wider landscape. Target 12 aimed to prevent the extinction of known threatened species and to improve their conservation status. The world's birds have continued to be driven towards extinction since 2010. As you can see, the Red List Index continues to show declines. But a key piece of research has shown that it would have been much worse without conservation action. BirdLife, in collaboration with Newcastle University and others, convened a group of species conservation experts to estimate the probability that species would have gone extinct in the absence of conservation action over the last decade. So without any protected areas, species recovery programs, or other interventions. And the graph on the right shows the results. You can see the minimum, maximum, and best estimates of the probability that each species would have gone extinct without any conservation action. And as you can see, the probability of extinction was very high in several species. So the top 6 species, Alagoas curassow, Guam kingfisher, Guam rail, Hawaiian crow, Socorro dove, and Spix's macaw, were totally extinct in the wild during that period, meaning that they had a 100% probability of extinction without conservation action. And several others, such as the Bali myna and orange-bellied parrot, were estimated to have around a 90% chance of extinction. The researchers concluded that since 2010, between 9 and 18 additional species would have gone extinct, and extinction rates would have been 2 to 4 times higher in the absence of any conservation action. So this shows that conservation does work. Despite the negative trends that we're seeing, examples like these show that we can turn things around. Strategic goal D was to enhance the benefits to all from biodiversity and ecosystem services. Target 14 looked at safeguarding and restoring ecosystems that provide essential services. Nature provides us with many benefits, from climate regulation to provision of clean water, but provision of those services is reliant on a healthy, functioning ecosystem, and degradation of nature is reducing its ability to provide those services. For example, birds are important pollinators for some plant groups, but the Red List Index for pollinating birds shows that they are continuing to decline. However, data on ecosystem service flows under different management or land use options show that conservation and restoration of important sites for birds often delivers positive outcomes for people as well as biodiversity. And this is really encouraging evidence that there are win-win situations for people and nature. If we conserve areas for birds, we also benefit the local community by safeguarding the resources that they use, such as forests and pollinating species, as well as benefiting the global community by enhancing ecosystem services like carbon sequestration for climate regulation. Strategic goal E was to enhance implementation through participatory planning, knowledge management, and capacity building. Target 18 focused on integrating traditional knowledge into conservation. Indigenous peoples and traditional knowledge have the potential to play a really important role in the conservation of nature. 17% of important bird and biodiversity areas, and nearly 1/5 of the total IBA area, falls within land owned or managed by Indigenous peoples, meaning that there is a great potential for their engagement in conservation. And this is already happening in some areas. For example, in the Middle East, the revival of a traditional community management system called HEMA at IBAs and other sites is already helping to conserve birds and other biodiversity. Target 19 was to improve and share knowledge of biodiversity. This is absolutely critical if we are to save nature. And birds provide some fantastic examples of how we can do this. Far more research is published on birds than any other group of species. So over 300 articles on the topic of bird conservation alone are published in scientific journals every year. And as well as the scientists, there is a huge army of bird watchers logging records of birds every single minute of every single day. The world's largest citizen science repository, eBird, receives more than 140 million observations per year. And just last month, BirdLife was involved in promoting the Global Bird Weekend, where people from across the world record as many birds as they can in a single weekend. This year's Global Bird Weekend actually smashed world records for the number of species recorded. Over 7,100 bird species were recorded on the Saturday alone. And that's around 3/4 of the world's bird species recorded in a single day. And this vast quantity of data on birds is one of the things that makes them such brilliant indicators of environmental change. The final target, Target 20, focused on mobilizing resources for implementing the strategic plan for biodiversity. Saving nature requires substantially scaled up investment from governments, multilateral institutions, the private sector, and from philanthropy. And because birds are so popular, they are increasingly engaging companies and individuals to step up and support conservation. So this map shows the locations of threatened species supported by BirdLife species champions. Over 100 companies or individuals have signed up as species champions, donating funds to support really critical conservation work to protect some of the most threatened bird species in the world. And as you can see from this map, the species champions are having a huge impact across the globe. So to summarize, we pulled together data, indicators, and research on birds, showing that none of the Aichi targets were met in full. But for each target, there are inspiring examples of positive trends and successes for some sets of species in some parts of the world or for some aspect of the target, showing that we do have the ability to turn things around and help nature to recover. But what does all of this mean for the negotiations currently underway for the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework? I'm going to hand over to Noelle, who's going to talk us through what needs to happen next.
Thank you very much, Lucy. So as Lucy mentioned, these analyses provide some really crucial insight into development of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's been much delayed in terms of the negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it's expected to be signed at the CBD's 15th Conference of the Parties in the latter half of next year. Next slide. So, as you've seen, our report highlights the successes and failures of the current global biodiversity strategy and provides some valuable lessons for the new framework. So firstly, the new framework needs to ensure we're on track to achieve the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, with a clear overarching mission to ensure that we're nature positive by 2030. This must be clear that we must not only halt the loss of biodiversity, but start to recover it by 2030 in order to ensure full recovery by 2050. There needs to be a clear theory of change, mapping a pathway to achieve this mission, distinguishing outcome-focused goals from action-orientated targets and a set of enabling conditions. These new targets must be much more ambitious in certain areas and much more smart. And by this, we mean specific, measurable, ambitious, realistic, and time-bound. And we add to this unambiguous and scalable, to ensure that they're clear and progress can be tracked. Next slide. So as mentioned, we need a set of outcome-focused goals to achieve by 2030 as a milestone to 2050. These should deliver against the three overarching goals of the Convention, which is conservation, sustainable use, and equitable sharing of the genetic benefits of biodiversity. And also the three levels of biodiversity: ecosystem, species, and genetic. So the goals need to retain and restore natural ecosystems, which includes ecosystem integrity and connectivity, as well as area. They need to halt human-induced species extinctions and safeguard the diversity and recover the abundance of life. They need to enhance genetic diversity of wild and domestic species and ensure the sustainable and equitable provision of nature's benefits to people. Next slide. And next, we need a set of action-orientated targets for 2030 to cover conservation actions, addressing the threats to biodiversity, ensuring nature's contributions to people, and promoting the enabling conditions for the implementation of the framework. So I'll run through a few of these key areas that these targets should cover, but this should be noted that this isn't a comprehensive list. So firstly, the conservation actions should cover comprehensive biodiversity inclusive spatial planning to safeguard natural ecosystems, a scaled up, more effective target to protect and conserve key areas for biodiversity, ensuring the recognition of the role and rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, IPLCs, and also a dedicated species action target. Targets to reduce the threats to biodiversity should ensure the sustainable, legal and safe use and trade of wild species, eradicate or control invasive alien species, and reduce all sources of pollution. Next slide. The targets for meeting people's needs should employ nature-based solutions to address climate change and disaster risk and deliver wider ecosystem services. They should sustainably manage agriculture and other managed ecosystems and ensure access to biodiversity for health and well-being. Targets promoting enabling conditions should mainstream or embed biodiversity into wider decision-making, promote sustainable production and consumption, mobilize finance, ensure biodiversity data availability, and enable effective and equitable inclusion of people in decision-making and implementation, in particular of Indigenous peoples and local communities. Next slide. In order to track progress towards the goals and targets, we need indicators. As we've shown, bird data provides the basis for a set of key biodiversity indicators, which already track progress towards the Aichi targets, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are emboldened here. These should be carried forward and further developed where necessary for the post-2020 framework. For example, the current indicator, second to the bottom, of protected area coverage of key biodiversity areas has already been adjusted to incorporate coverage of other effective area-based conservation measures. So we can now track how well all types of protected and conserved areas focus on the areas of most importance for biodiversity. And this will be reflected in the 2021 Sustainable Development Goals report. Next slide. However, the greatest failure of the current strategic plan for biodiversity has not been the targets themselves, but the lack of implementation. So the following enabling conditions must be addressed if we're to have any hope of reversing biodiversity loss. First, we need a much stronger mechanism for implementing the new framework, including improved monitoring, reporting, and verification of progress towards the goals and targets. This includes ideally legally binding national targets that can be added up to show progress at a global level, adequately resourcing the underlying data sets that provide our indicators, and putting in place adequately resourced implementation strategies for each target at national and global level. Second, given half of global GDP is dependent on nature, we need to start valuing it. Currently, nature is not internalized into economic systems, incentivizing its degradation rather than conservation. Ultimately, conservation alone will never be sufficient unless we fundamentally rethink how we value nature in wider society. There's a whole range of approaches we need to employ here, from reorientating subsidies, investing in nature-based solutions, to ensuring nature-related financial disclosure for business and investors, ensuring a just transition where necessary. We should move from voluntary to regulated approaches to level the playing field and ensure uptake at the pace and scale needed. Next slide. And then beyond mainstreaming biodiversity into economic systems, we need to ensure it's embedded into wider society and across government, and include all relevant actors and stakeholders in the delivery of the framework. We must embed and deliver key principles, such as a rights-based approach, intergenerational equity, and the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities, supporting the universal right to a healthy environment, which is currently being advocated through the UN more widely. And finally, we need to ensure synergies with other policy processes at global, regional, and national level. And as biodiversity knows no borders, international cooperation is vital for this. The plan should commit parties to incorporate nature-based solutions for climate change into national biodiversity and climate action plans, and build on targets and indicators that are already used for the SDGs, all of which have a deadline of 2030. Countries and other stakeholders must in particular work together on global and transboundary issues, such as migratory species and the high seas, to ensure conservation and development planning is undertaken at ecologically relevant scale. Next slide. And then you can read our full report at this link. And we also have a web story on the BirdLife website covering our recommendations for the implementation aspects of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework.
Thanks very much, Noelle and Lucy, for joining me in giving you that summary. And I hope that that provides a nice overview of what we've been publicising over recent weeks, and gives you an appreciation of why birds are such useful environmental indicators, of how they can tell us about the state of the planet, the pressures upon it, and the conservation responses that are needed. And they show that overall, we failed to meet the Aichi targets. These bold commitments that governments made is a pretty miserable failure. But it's not all doom and gloom, because for each of those targets, there are positive case studies, there are success stories, there are positive trends. Birds provide us with reasons for hope. It's not all bad news. There are some great and inspiring examples of success. And overall, these results have implications for the current negotiations that are happening between governments to develop a new plan for the next decade. We need to have better targets that are more smartly articulated and more focused. We need to have much stronger implementation mechanisms. We need to reform our economic system so that the values of biodiversity are integrated into economic decision making. We need to mainstream biodiversity across all sectors. It's not just a niche activity for the Ministry of the Environment, but needs to be at the heart of all government policy and across all sectors of society. And we need better and stronger international cooperation. Thank you very much. So we'll hand back to Patricia, and we look forward to some discussion now and hearing some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Stu and Lucy and Noelle. That was great. And thanks to you who have posted great questions already. I would like to start with David Davidson's question and ask maybe Noelle if you can start, but then Stu, maybe you can pitch in as well. Are the conservation subsidies for forestry, wetlands and grasslands in the US controlled, introduced at state or federal government level? Well, I can jump in and tell you.
Yes, I was going to say, I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that one because I'm not that familiar with the US. Yeah.
Well, but so a lot of these subsidies are actually controlled by the Farm Bill in the US, and they're passed by Congress at the federal level, but then there are also a set of incentives and subsidies happening at the state level. So it heavily depends on what state you are in, but there's a combination of both. You heard through the presentation, and maybe this is where you can jump in, Noelle, and Stu after that. There's a series of opportunities right now to start rethinking the way that we are subsidizing destructive uses of land that are jeopardizing the state of nature. And in one of our Green Recovery webinars, we heard from the former Minister of Environment of Costa Rica, now the Chief Executive of the Global Environment Facility, that we are investing in subsidies 50 times more and destroying nature than what we are actually investing in protecting nature. So why is it so important to tackle destructive subsidies? Noelle, can we start with that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely critical. We have an enormous, I sort of mentioned the fact that, we don't value nature adequately, and this is a really key first goal to hit. The subsidies act against rather than for nature, and some of these targets, for example, subsidies against fossil fuels, it's already a sustainable development goal. So it's not even, it's a no-brainer. We really should be acting towards that agriculture as well. So this is absolutely critical. And you mentioned in fact, and Lucy's slide showed this well, but the government policies and ensuring that subsidies do deliver on public goods rather than against them currently. And for an example, here in the UK where I'm based, but we're currently moving away from the European Union Common Agricultural Policy and looking at a more environmentally friendly system where we value nature within, the idea is that we value nature better within subsidies. So absolutely critical, and we saw in the US how that actually is working at farm level and at national level to increase abundances of birds. So it can be done, it is being done, but there needs to be much stronger focus on this as a first easy win in theory for nature.
I was going to say that subsidies and incentive systems are an incredibly powerful tool that governments have. They really influence people's behaviour because they are hitting their bottom line or impacting their bottom line by providing economic incentives. You can really change people's behaviour. Unfortunately, to date, governments around the world have poured vast sums of money into activities that make really no economic sense or environmental sense. We pay huge sums to farmers to create food that goes to waste, rather than paying them to manage land in ways that benefit all of society. We incentivize fishing fleets to unsustainably over-harvest fish stocks, jeopardizing the future returns that we can obtain from the world's oceans, and jeopardizing the future generations of fisherfolk. So if these can be reversed, and there are some great examples where more environmentally friendly incentives and subsidy systems are introduced, we can deliver really impactful changes that are beneficial for the environment.
Thank you, Stu. And actually, one of the graphs that Lucy showed on how incentives for, say, for example, the Wetland Conservation Act in the US has enabled to actually recover not only extraordinary amounts of wetland in terms of acreage and hectares, but also populations of threatened birds. The only other thing that I wanted to say before jumping on to the next question is that we have been talking about how resource deprived the conservation sector is. And we are proving that the problem is not that the money is not there. The money is just going to the wrong things right now. So channeling the subsidy funding into nature and incentives that can go into nature restoration, regenerative agriculture, for example, a more holistic agriculture system and fishery system could help us protect nature at the same time that we're feeding people properly and we're treating the planet rightly. So it is a matter of policy. It is a matter of having the right data, and it's a matter of using the right economic instruments for the right things. Let me jump into Connor's question. What can we as the scientific community learn from the 2011-2020 target results to prevent us having the same conversation at the end of the post-2020 biodiversity targets? Can we start with Lucy, perhaps? Lucy, what do you think?
Of course, yeah, I think that's a really, really good question. And, you know, we made all these really bold ambitious targets last time, and we didn't achieve them. And as you say, there's this real risk that we could go and just do that again. But that's why it's really important for the decision makers to take notice of all of this data. You know, we've found all of these successes that show that we do have the right tools to achieve these goals. It's not that we don't have the tools, it's just that they're not being implemented correctly. So it's really important going forward that the decision makers do make use of this data that we have gathered together and others have gathered today together to show what methods do work. And those will be the methods that will hopefully make the difference going forward into the next decade. But really good question. And I think it's absolutely vital that we do make a difference this time. You know, we're sort of getting towards our last chance now, really, to make this work. So it's sort of a now or never situation.
Agreed.
I think one of the key insights is that those targets and the wording of them were negotiated in dimly lit rooms in the middle of the night between 180 or 100, a large number of parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And in some cases, what emerged and was eventually adopted is, in parts, very difficult to interpret what was meant, and no real consideration, or not inadequate consideration, was given to how we're going to measure these things. So I was heavily involved in the efforts in 2004-05 to undertake a midterm evaluation of progress to the Aichi Targets that then appeared in the previous Global Biodiversity Outlook, the fourth one, and then through the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, their first global assessment to try and evaluate progress to the Aichi Targets. And for some of these targets, it's not fully clear what success would look like and how you would define it, and therefore how can we measure whether we've achieved it. And so it's not surprising that governments in some cases were a bit uncertain as to what precise actions were needed to be implemented in order to achieve this slightly amorphous picture of success. So we need to get much better at ensuring that the next set of targets are carefully worded, it's very precise what we're trying to achieve, and that we have a monitoring framework and a set of indicators that are adopted at the same time as the targets. This is what we're committing to achieve, and this is how we're going to measure our progress towards achieving that. And those indicators need to be used not just at the global scale, but by each of the governments, the parties to the convention, so that we can compare progress, and individual countries can see how they're what progress they're making towards each component of each target.
Thanks, Stu. Noel, anything in terms of what we need to do differently this time to avoid failing?
I think there's quite a lot we need to do differently. And I think that the current strategic plan was an improvement on the one before. The targets were better, but as Stu said, you know, we were still arguing about indicators halfway through the course of the plan, and so there's a lot of that technical side that needs to improve. But we have the basis for this framework. We have already got a good set of indicators, operational and things like that. So we've got a bit of a head start in some of that. I think we've been talking a lot about the smartness of targets. I'm absolutely sure we'll still be arguing over this in the middle of the night in Kunming when we sign the framework gets finally signed off. But that's all really critically important. And the first point in the enabling conditions was on a strengthened implementation sort of mechanism, which includes this monitoring, reporting, verification process, a key implementation strategies for the targets, so that we don't just have a target for 2030 and just hope we get there. We have to have a plan, a finance plan to get there for each of the targets. So there's a lot of that that I think we're working through better, or should be now. But really critically, it's also about mainstreaming and embedding, raising awareness of the value of nature and embedding it into kind of wider global policy. That point on a framework for all is really, really key. So it's getting business, people, all of society behind this. There's a much stronger momentum from civil society for change. There's a much more dire need for change. So, you know, we are at a kind of critical juncture now that we have to take that right path. I mentioned COVID, and this is again a kind of make or break time where we have to ensure we don't have a repeat of another pandemic like this, and ensure that we value nature better through the process of recovery, and ensure we have a green recovery. So there's very much, you know, this is a really critical moment for getting nature embedded into wider systems, and I think we're making progress, but it needs constant pressure and constant advocacy for that. And we have now as well, just a couple of things. We have the Paris Agreement on Climate, and we have the Sustainable Development Goals in place now. As I say, both aligned with the time period of this next framework, and they have themselves got momentum behind them. So if we hook nature to those processes as well, ensure these synergies, that's a real potential there to get sort of coherent national global action on this joint agenda.
Okay, let's move on to conservation measures. And there's a question from Rob, and Rob, is lovely to see you. Is there any data or published information that shows that World Heritage Sites are beneficial to biodiversity? And I want to string it with George Ledec's question on the 30%. If I can find it, yeah, that's the 30% of global conservation area include only protected areas with a designated management authority, or also partially protected areas that have legal protection but not designated management authority. Like in some countries, laws prohibit any clearing of mangrove forests. So would all the mangroves in that country be counted as part of the 30% target, or only those mangroves within designated protected areas? So let's start with the World Heritage Site nomination and the role that they play, and then let's move into the 30%. Who wants to take that one
on? No, do you want to do the first
I can
part?
go for World Heritage a bit, yeah. So World Heritage Sites are designated for their outstanding universal value to humanity. We have two types, natural and cultural. And so even not all natural World Heritage Sites are designated for biodiversity per se. They can have landscape value. But that said, a number of them are, and there's often a huge crossover with important areas for birds and biodiversity and key biodiversity areas. IUCN is an official advisory body to the World Heritage Convention, and we are a partner on the IUCN World Heritage Outlook, which tracks progress, tracks the status of natural World Heritage Sites. So yeah, that monitors biodiversity in World Heritage Sites specifically. So yes, it's being looked at. Certainly, even if it's not designated for its biodiversity value, that's one of the things that's tracked through the World Heritage Outlook process.
And from practical experience, some of you may know that I'm Ecuadorian. The fact that the Galapagos Islands and the Galapagos National Park was designated a World Heritage Site many, many, many years ago, I think it was one of the first ones actually, made a huge difference in terms of the implications and the policies that the government put in place for making sure that the park was protected. And when the status of the World Heritage Site was in danger, it forced the government to actually take stronger measures to make sure that the park was protected. So I think it is, I mean, I'm sure that there are measures somewhere there, but it is just anecdotally in this particular case, a huge opportunity to make sure that we put pressure on the decision makers to ensure that these areas are well managed and protected. So I would say definitely yes.
I think there's an example from the Australia and the Great Barrier Reef as well, where the World Heritage designation there has focused a media and public spotlight on the condition of the reef and the policies of the Australian government.
But collectively, these are our jewels in the crown, and they are not like all protected areas, they are not under threat. So there is, within the World Heritage Convention process, big, lots of discussion on ensuring no impact, no-go policies and no impact. The Galapagos is a good example at the moment, impacts outside these World Heritage sites. So it's a big question how we really ensure effective protection of these sorts of areas. And that's not always, even for World Heritage sites, a very pretty story, unfortunately, both, and the Great Barrier Reef is another example, which is really, its biodiversity value is really declining from the threats inside and outside, which we're raising awareness of, but still a big challenge.
And on George's question about the 30% target, so this is about site-based conservation. So it is about individual areas of land that have been designated rather than broader scale habitat policy like the mangrove example that you give. But it's not just about protected areas. So this language was introduced into Aichi Target 11 in 2010 about conserving protected areas and what they called other effective area-based conservation measures. And this was language that was negotiated to try and capture things like indigenous reserves, community managed areas, some private protected areas that governments don't recognize, to recognize the fact that these deliver biodiversity outcomes but don't fall under the protected area umbrella. There's a lot of devil in the detail there, though, and it took about 8 years to come up with and agree a definition of what these OECMs, as they're called, actually are, and how you would identify one. And it's an example of one of the reasons of why there's been less progress to the targets than we would have liked. And the same language is being carried over to the current draft of the post-2020 plan. So there's now a database being managed by the UN Environment Programme's World Conservation Monitoring Centre, who manage the world database on protected areas. And a few countries have started to submit data on OECMs. BirdLife led a piece of research that Lucy referred to, where we took a sample of 10 countries around the world, both developed and developing, and from all the major continents. And we worked with our local BirdLife partners to look at key biodiversity areas, important bird and biodiversity areas, and other sites important for biodiversity that fell outside of formal protected areas, and asked the question, how many of these appeared to be managed in ways that would be consistent with the OECM definition? So how many are covered by community reserves, indigenous peoples reserves, and so on? And it was a really high proportion, something like 3/4 of IBAs and KBAs that fall outside of protected areas appear to be covered by OECM. So this is a potentially really important mechanism for conservation at the site scale beyond protected areas.
Great. Let me go back to a couple of questions about land management. Do you think that taking a holistic land management approach at governmental level would be helpful in restoration of ecosystems? And I'm gonna dovetail that with another question about the Environment Land Management Scheme in the UK and whether we think that that is actually going to produce good results.
Maybe on the first of those, absolutely. We face, as a society and governments, in leading their national societies, face multiple challenges. How can we provide enough food? How can we conserve our nature? How can we ensure effective transport? All of these different demands on the lands and seas around these countries. And part of the problem with and the explanation for why we're in a nature crisis is because different parts of the government are working independently and in an unjoined up way. Environment is the thing that the Ministry of Environment does, agriculture does the farming, fisheries does the fisheries, and these things aren't integrated together. We need holistic land and sea spatial planning that integrates biodiversity concerns, nature and environment alongside where are we going to put our roads, where are we going to farm our land, and where are we going to generate energy, and ensuring that we meet multiple objectives. And there are various studies showing that it's feasible to produce the food that the planet needs. It's feasible to develop the energy from renewable sources alongside conserving nature, but you've got to do it in a joined up and coordinated way. So yeah, holistic planning is absolutely critical.
Thanks, Stu. I want to acknowledge one of the chief executives of the BirdLife partners, Miguel Araujo from El Salvador, talking about whether we should actually take advantage of the COVID pandemic as an opportunity to really restore the model and look into a green decade. Noel, what do you think?
Yes, and Miguel would know. He's working very hard on that agenda himself. Yeah, it's an opportunity, but one we have to seize, and collectively, as I sort of mentioned on that. And there's the various stages of the green recovery, and of course we need to think about the immediacy of money, immediate funds going to the green recovery right now, ensuring that they don't work against nature, where we have the priority of livelihoods, jobs, filling gaps. That's understandably going to have a kind of really urgent focus on that side of things. As we move to the mid and long term, we need to make sure that green recovery packages actually address the reasons we're in this mess, and recover better, greener, and look at the ways we can invest in renewable energy, in green jobs, in nature-based solutions. So there's a whole range of ways we can recover better from this, and that we can, it's happening, and governments to different extents are addressing this, but there is now is the time, and the coming months are really critical to get these principles established, and get both the finance and the wider strategies, the policies in place to ensure this.
So let's talk about the role of local community and local activity. And there's a question from Deb Revel about how important a role does local activity and pressure from residents on legislators and businesses play? Is it easier to educate and influence lawmakers, businesses, and other implementers from a local perspective rather than from a global? What do we think?
I could jump in, Stu. Obviously, yes, all levels important, but at the end of the day, action happens locally. And one process through the CBD, and actually a really interesting and good process to follow, is this sub-national governments track, which is getting local governments and state level, and those actions are better integrated into the framework. Some really great examples. So there's been a kind of series of dialogues and a declaration spearheading this, and this is where this is the coalface where we need action to happen, and coordinate this so that it gets embedded into national biodiversity strategies and action plans. But without that bit happening, and without that energy and effort, action at local level, we're not going to progress. And even where, for example, going back to the US example, where the US isn't a signatory to the CBD, so won't be signing up to this global biodiversity framework, there is still amazing action happening at state level, at city level, And those are really good actions to highlight and share lessons between those different kind of stakeholder groups.
Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, you know, for those parts of the world that are functioning democracies, our decision makers and leaders are always have more than half an eye on their re-election prospects, and they respond to what are the concerns of the people that are voting for them or voting them out of office. And so awareness and raising concern and communicating the concern that people feel about particular issues has a huge influence on government agendas. So we absolutely have to work right from the ground up, building awareness and building constituencies of people who are championing nature and saying, this is what we care about, and this is, you know, what's going to influence our votes, you know, when it comes to making decisions about which parties and which leaders we want to put into power. So we have to be working at all levels from the local to directly with governments and via businesses as well. Companies have paid increasing attention to their reputations and their environmental impacts because people have increasingly been holding them to account and making consumer choices about the products they buy that are at least partly influenced by the environmental credentials of the companies that produce those products. We have choices as to what we spend our money on and what we buy, what food we eat, and what products we consume to a greater or lesser degree, and obviously a much greater degree in those societies that are more affluent, and we can use that power to influence what companies do and increasingly force them to operate in a more environmentally sensitive way.
So that's an excellent segue for Alexander's question about the role of the private sector and which would be the indicators that you particularly recommend for businesses so they can mitigate adverse biodiversity impacts. And before I let you guys respond to that, I wanted to say it was fascinating when we were doing one of the Green Recovery webinars and we had the World Economic Forum at the table. It was right at the time when the WEF had put out their report in July, and it was fascinating to see that more than 50% of the GDP of the planet is actually linked directly to nature, and the dependence that we have from the business world on nature is incredibly important. However, only 5% of the Forbes or the S&P registered companies are actually effectively reporting on the impact to biodiversity. So this question on indicators is incredibly important. It is changing, and we're seeing that changing. And as Stu and Noel alluded, the fact that we have international agreements actually push the private sector into that direction and connects that global to local action. But I'd be interesting to hear your thoughts about what are, in your perspective, the right indicators and which are the indicators that relate more directly to business world.
Yeah, this has been a real challenge, you know, for those companies that have heard the message and heard from their consumers, as I was just suggesting. To be fair to them to a degree, it's been difficult for them to understand the full details of their impacts on nature and what they can do about it because of the lack of readily available indicators. So to try and there's a whole bunch of initiatives going on to try and take that work forward and improve that situation. BirdLife have been closely involved in one recently, which is still sort of at the pilot stage, which has been to develop a metric called STAR, species threat abatement and restoration. And it basically allows individuals, companies, businesses, governments, or even cities to quantify the contribution that they could make in reducing the global extinction risk of species. So if we have an overall aim of trying to improve the status of the world species, and this is just one aspect of biodiversity, you would want similar things for ecosystems and so on. If we want to improve the status of the world species, we need to reduce the threats that are impacting them, and we need to restore their populations where they've been depleted. And this metric is based on data that BirdLife and others have developed on the distribution of each species. So where is every species found, and what are the threats impacting them? And by taking those two sets of data together, you can quantify for any individual pixel, or it could be the extent of a country, or in the case of businesses, their footprint. So what are these sites they're operating at across the world? And within those locations, what's the overall proportion of all threats to all species that are encompassed by those particular places? And therefore, what's the potential that that company could make to reducing overall extinction risk? And this is being modeled on the approach with climate change, where there's a global target around global temperature rise and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, such that an individual country, for example, can work out what its contribution would be and be measured against that potential contribution. So this is an effort to bring to bear data on birds, data on the threats to them, alongside data on other species and the threats to those, in a spatially explicit way, to support companies to try and set targets for reducing their impacts on nature.
Yeah, and I think making it easier for private sector also, trying to help them understand or really digesting the data, all of the fantastic data that we have on biodiversity that is so complicated, into simpler indicators that they can mainstream and use and they can report on. And I think this is a huge role that the Task Force on Nature Disclosure is going to have to play now that that is being established, and we're very much looking forward to not only participating in, but for the results of that. Let me jump into before we move away from private sector right now, energy and renewable energy and the transition to renewable energy. There's a question about how in Sweden wind power plants are sprouting everywhere and how harmful they can be. Noelle, this is for you.
Well, it's an extremely timely question because we've just had day 2 of our annual meeting of the Convention on Migratory Species Energy Task Force, which is looking at how we reconcile renewable energy developments with the conservation of migratory species, and more broadly with nature more generally, is something we are addressing. So yeah, you're right in that there is potential for renewable energy. If we slap it down in the wrong place, it can have impacts on species and it can have impacts on important areas for biodiversity. So we are developing tools. We have the integrated biodiversity assessment tool and a sensitivity mapping process, which both help to identify risky sensitive areas and guide the planning and siting of these sorts of developments. And we're also working on ways of mitigating the impacts of wind or solar installations, power lines that are already in place and where they're already causing collisions and electrocutions of birds, for example. So we have a task force that's busy working, and it's a multi-stakeholder task force, work with government members, private sector, researchers and NGOs working together to identify these solutions, to share best practice and develop guidance to share more widely. And if you're interested in learning any more, there's a pair of public webinars tomorrow. I need to try and find the link, put it in the chat. that hosted by BirdLife, who coordinates the Energy Task Force, along with the Convention on Migratory Species. So there are 2 webinars tomorrow with a whole range of governments and private sector and international financial institutions sharing their experiences on this topic. So yeah, really critically important that we have a nature-sensitive renewable energy transition, but we mustn't prevent it, because we need that renewable energy transition is critical for the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate, to keep us under 1.5 degrees of temperature rise. So we really need it, and we need to engage very rapidly and urgently, and as part of these green recovery packages, to ensure that it is happening in the right way, and happening urgently, but in the right way.
I want to go back to protected areas and link 2 questions from George. One is about KVAs and how many of the KVAs are, how many of the worldwide, what percentage of worldwide KVAs that exist in reality have been actually identified, listed and mapped, and then link that to OECMs. Stu, can we take that on?
Sure. So that first one's a really interesting one. We don't know is the short answer. We did a piece of work some years ago where we looked at the relationship between IBAs and KVAs that have been identified to date in hotspots funded by the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund. Much of it was under Patricia's tenure as CEO there. And we asked what was the proportion of the global KVA estate that the IBAs formed. And that showed that the network of important sites for birds comprised about 2/3 of the sites for the wider network of KVAs for wider biodiversity, and 3/4 of their area. But that was before the adoption of a new global standard for the identification of KVAs, which expands even further. So my guess is if the important sites for birds and currently identified KVAs for other taxa and aspects of biodiversity cover 9 or 10% of the planet, then we might be looking at between half as much again and twice as much again. But it'll vary quite a lot by country, I suspect. You know, there are countries like Paraguay that have had very, very extensive habitat loss, and probably most of the important places for biodiversity are already captured in the existing KVA network. In other countries like Canada, where there's extensive habitat remaining, there may be many other sites for other taxa that haven't yet been identified as KVAs. But it's early days, and in short, we don't fully know the answer to that question yet. We'll have a better idea in a few years' time, once more countries have applied the global standard to all groups of species. And on OECMs and protected areas, it's really complicated and confusing. So some indigenous managed areas are recognized by their governments as protected areas, as you point out in your question, and so those count as protected areas. By definition, OECMs are not protected areas, so they're things like that haven't been recognized by governments. So other indigenous areas would count as OECMs. But yeah, different governments take a different approach to what they report in terms of their global protected area estate, and some of them recognize private protected areas, others don't. But together, these two concepts are intended to capture the full suite of sites that are being managed in a way that's beneficial for nature, whether or not that's the primary objective.
Super. I want to talk about capacity. 1 second. There have been a couple of questions about the role of capacity building and how can we ensure that the scientific community keeps learning and has the opportunity to build their capacity. Who wants to take that on? How do we make sure that the scientific community still continues to grow and continues to grow their capacity so we don't lose it?
It's hugely important. There's a whole work stream under the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services focused around capacity building. A disproportionate amount of the data that's available on biodiversity, the science and research that's done, the publications that come out, are in parts of the world like the UK that really is of trivial global importance for biodiversity, you know, relative to the Congos or you know, the Bolivias, the Myanmars, places that are hugely important for biodiversity, but have much less well resourced and less well developed scientific institutions and education systems and research programs. So it's massively important to transfer knowledge and skills from developed countries to support capacity building efforts for science and for conservation, you know, much more broadly in these countries. And of course, that's a central component of BirdLife's programs, and a really big and important part of what we do. And also building capacity and making linkages and sharing lessons between developing countries from south to south, not just always north to south or from the west. And there's a huge amount that can be achieved through that kind of capacity building as well.
And yeah, just to add on that, on in the wider capacity building sense, it's also, yeah, it's about developing capacity and engaging with for us as BirdLife, with our 115 partners around the world, but working with them to engage with local communities, indigenous peoples, so that we recognise their role in conserving biodiversity, and also look to being able to work with them to track it as well. So looking at community-based monitoring, for example, which is challenging, but looking at all this different sorts of citizen science and ways and means of bringing people information from people and working with people better, so that we're collectively able to both implement and conserve, but also track progress towards the global targets ultimately. So that's like a key reason for being of BirdLife, but it definitely shouldn't be sort of undervalued, and I mean that in its widest sense. And it's a really big task, it's a big challenge, but I think that's where we have to move forward in the next, within this framework, is better recognising that role of indigenous peoples and local communities in terms of helping us to conserve biodiversity is really important.
And then moving into thinking about the role of local people, but not only in terms of the management of protected areas, but also as citizen science and citizen scientists. And I want to make a reference to Hugh's comment about the BirdLife membership. Because we have 115 organizations around the world and every single partner has a membership. How can we make sure that we are not underusing the role of the membership and how they are actually able to contribute their knowledge and experience and the wealth of that experience and knowledge. We're running out of time, and I want to thank everybody for these wonderful questions. Some of them we have not been able to go through, but it's been great to have all of them. Thank you so much for participating. I just want to make a couple of announcements while Sarah is going to put a screen on in front of you. Number one is, do not forget to join us on our Red List webinar. We will have our webinar. Sarah, remind me, what's the date of the Red List webinar, when we will be sharing with you which are the species that we have downlisted, uplisted, which are the ones that are closer to extinction, unfortunately, and we have to take extremely important action, but those that we have actually been able to move them away from extinction thanks to all this fantastic conservation work. Sarah, that date?
That is on the 17th of December, and that one is at 2:30 p.m. GMT.
Okay, wonderful. And the other thing that we wanted to let you know, for those of you who are not in the United States, you may not be familiar with this, but today is Giving Tuesday. So if you have enjoyed this webinar and the quality, extraordinary quality of the presentations and the information that you've heard from Lucy, Stu, and Noel, think about supporting us. It is incredibly important to get your support to help us keep moving, keep maintaining the quality of our science, keep maintaining the quality of our data, ensuring that we are connecting to our partners, that our partners are connecting to their membership and to their constituencies, and mobilizing their local civil society, their local governments, their the business world that needs to be on the side of this new agenda for nature. So if you click in birdlife.org /donate, you can see all of the different campaigns that we have up there. We count on you, and thank you so much for joining us and supporting us. And thanks to you three fantastic panelists for all your support. The link to the State of the World Birds report that was so kindly supported by the Jensen Foundation is on the chat room, so take a look at that if you can. And we very much look forward to having you in a couple of weeks' time for the Red List webinar, and when we will be closing the year, but announcing some of exciting news about webinars in the next year. So thanks again. Lovely to have all of you. And yeah, consider donating to BirdLife. And happy Giving Tuesday. And thanks so much for joining us.